Hi, this is John Traynor, and I'm happy to be joining you today to talk to you a little bit about the origin and descent of the Traynor clans of Ireland. Before we get started, I'd like to say that this DNA initiative is the most collaborative merger of genetic, family history, and public records that I've ever seen for genealogy, perhaps outside of royal families. And I want to take a moment to thank everyone who helped to make it happen. The Irish men and women who contributed their family histories and shared information about their homelands and their nicknames, Irishmen and Americans and other immigrants, Australians, British, Spanish, who have taken DNA tests and shared their results, and information that has come from all of these groups to help to build our database of Irish history and Traynor history. In addition, I'd like to give a big shout out to all of the members who have made contributions to the initiative financially to allow us to help to subsidize members of the Irish community who had the interest and the ability to participate in the project. We do subsidize Irish members' participation because we value and appreciate the information that you have to offer. Now, with that said, I'm going to take my face off the screen and do the rest of the presentation on full screen just with content. Now, I'd like to talk to you next about DNA and what DNA is and means. So, you are here if your name is Traynor. Are there any questions? Okay, well, maybe let's roll it back a little bit and start with the basics. What is DNA? Well, regardless of what they told you in high school, DNA stands for do not be afraid. DNA is simply the blueprint for who we are. It's formed by 4 proteins. We'll call them A, G, T, and C, but they have longer names, that combine in unique and individual ways to tell our bodies and our brains how to develop. There are multiple types of DNA, but let's talk about 3 in particular for our purpose. The first one is mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA lives outside of the nucleus of every cell in your body and helps to convert proteins into food. So basically, they're little food factories for your body. And those mitochondrial DNA, we'll talk about a little more, but you inherit from your mother's 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 mother. Secondly, there are the sex chromosomes. Men have a pair called X and Y, and women have 2 X's, X and X. And we're going to talk a lot about the Y DNA, the male DNA, that kind of determines boys and their toys. So what we call the Y chromosome. And finally, we're going to talk also a little bit about autosomal DNA. And autosomal DNA, chromosomes pair 1 through 10E2, comes from all of your ancestors and determines everything about you. Maybe your eye color, your hair color, or even some of the things you like or dislike. And we'll talk about each of these in their turn. It's also important to note that certain types of DNA doesn't get recombined or scrambled every generation, particularly mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes. So that information can be very helpful for us to trace long history of where people come from and who they're related to. Now, I'd like to talk for a moment about mitochondrial DNA before we go into the other material. Mitochondrial DNA is DNA that you inherit from your mother's 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 mother. And in my case, that's Ellen Cullen back in the early 1800s. And the Y DNA, as opposed to the mitochondrial DNA, is DNA that you inherit from your father's 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 father. In my case, that would be Bernard Traynor of Mullahinshigo in Monaghan. And then autosomal DNA is DNA that you inherit from all of your ancestors, including Bernard and Ellen, but also, my father's grandmother and my mother's grandfather, all sides of your family. And all of these pieces of DNA can be useful for us. But for a moment, I'm going to talk about mitochondrial DNA. We all inherit that mitochondrial, or for short, they put mtDNA, from our mother's 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 mother. And in our society, most women inherit their father's surname, and many of them take their husband's surname. So this makes relating surnames to mitochondrial DNA very different. For example, in my family, Ellen Cullen had a daughter named Bridget Kelly, who had a daughter named Winifred McGuire, who had a daughter named Alice Grogan, who had me. My and their mitochondrial DNA is called K1C2, and I can use that to do genealogical research. We have a wonderful opportunity to learn about our matrilineal line. Who were these women? Where did they come from? And if we want to find female descendants, for example, of Ellen Cullen, I can use my mitochondrial DNA as a clue. Now, Irish mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, seems to be part of a European Neolithic migration that came out of what we'll call the Near East. And you can see in the pink zone, all those one-character letters, I, J, K, T, U, V. Those are just abbreviations for particular types of mitochondrial DNA. And if we look, we see that certain types of DNA for mitochondrial DNA wound up going into the parts of Europe that Ireland is in, like T, U, V, W. And if we look at history by digging up bones and looking at DNA of people, we can see that around the year 4000 BC, the mitochondrial DNA of Europe changed dramatically from Mesolithic DNA of women to Neolithic. And that's because of a migration that happened at that time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And when we look at that pattern, it hasn't changed too much since about the year 2500. In fact, most women in Ireland today are H, mitochondrial DNA, about 40% of women. But there are other people too, like I, J, K, T, U, and I just happen to be a K. But there are lots of different types of mitochondrial DNA, and you can use that in your genealogical research. The expert on maternal line ancestry and the person who wants to lead that charge is Kathy Weber. So information is here. I invite you to reach out to Kathy because we're going to be ramping up our work that we're going to be doing on mitochondrial DNA, and Kathy is going to be leading that charge. Now, I mentioned autosomal DNA, which we inherit from all of our great-great-great-grandparents. And I'd like to talk about that a little more for a minute. Autosomal DNA comes from all of your ancestors, not just one side or the other. And it's very useful for finding cousins, typically first cousins to fifth cousins. Well, why only first to fifth? Well, autosomal DNA gets recombined. Think of it as being shuffled every generation. And it makes it harder to find cousins beyond about 5 generations. Think about putting a bunch of different food ingredients into a Cuisinart and pushing the button 5 times. Pretty soon it's kind of hard to tell what's what. Autosomal DNA, when you get your test results, can be uploaded to sites like GEDmatch. And Lee Crumby, who has been leading this charge, has created Traynor and Monaghan projects, which I think are very, very powerful for us to connect to each other. So I'm going to encourage you, if you have an interest in autosomal DNA, reach out to Leigh. She's been doing a fantastic job and leading the autosomal DNA charge, and she is certainly the expert on the topic. For the rest of today, I'm going to be talking more about Y-DNA, which men inherit from their father's 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 father, and women don't have Y-DNA. They have the X and X, and men have a Y and an X. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Y-DNA and why it's useful for us to track our Y-DNA's history and how we do that for genealogy. Now, male Y-DNA mutates by what's called one SNP mutation about every 80 to 100 years. What does SNP stand for? SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. Well, that's scary, I know, it's complicated, but it just means a little tiny DNA mutation, usually permanent. It doesn't give you superpowers. You can't fly or see through walls, but because they change and then they don't change back, we can look at these changes over time and trace back the history of a male line over thousands of years. And by doing that, we can even estimate when two different men had a common patrilineal ancestor. So when my father's father's father and your father's father were the same person. Y-DNA, as a result, can be like a time machine for doing family history and very powerful. So let's get into our Y-DNA time machine and go back to around 4500 BC with a Y-DNA SNP called R1b. Now that's complicated, so I'm just going to call it RIB for short. And we're going to talk about how this stuff leads to know more about the Traynor DNA and how your Traynor ancestors came to be in Ireland. Well, the first thing to know is that back around 4500, 5500 BC, a lot of things happened in a very short period of time. The first thing that happened was that the body of water that we call the Black Sea, which was previously a freshwater lake, suddenly there was a barrier that was broken through by the Mediterranean called the Bosphorus, which is next to Istanbul, that flooded the Black Sea and turned it from being a freshwater lake to being a salty sea. And the people who lived there obviously had to run for their lives. It didn't fill this quickly, but they estimate that it was the size of maybe 20 Niagara Falls, all next to each other, pushing water into the Black Sea. And you can imagine that was very disruptive for the people who lived there. They have found villages, the remains of villages under 30, 50, 100 feet of water in this area that got flooded from this time. And so these people had to run for their lives to get away from this incoming flood. What also happened during this time period were three very important things: the domestication of the horse in this area, probably around Ukraine, the development of the spoked wheel, and the development of bronze weapons. And all of these things happened in a very short period of time: the flood, horses, spoked wheels, and swords. So you can imagine this created a huge change in what was going on in that area at the time. There were also, at that time, happened to be a genetic marker of men that we'll call RIB, R1b. And I call it that, nobody else does. But these group of people, because of their power, the horses and wheels and swords, suddenly became very dominant. And what we see happening is that this group of people, who we now call the Yamna culture, spread out. And they spread east and west and created new cultures everywhere they went. And obviously it didn't happen overnight. It took 1,000 years, 2,000 years. But as these people migrated, they created new cultures everywhere they went. And you can see them going west to form the Celtic people, Celtic language people, and east into Afghanistan and Iran and northern India. So these people, this R1b, RIB, spread out all through Europe and Asia. And you can see their Y-DNA today coming from these people back to the year 4000 BC. So incredible changes happening. And while they moved, their language moved too. So these people who started out with a single language spread out. And some people went to India and they spoke Sanskrit or other languages, Punjab or Pashto. And other people went west and they became Greeks or they became Romans and they spoke Latin or other languages. And some of them came to the coast of England and Ireland. And those people spoke what we refer to today as Irish Gaelic. And so as these people moved, their language changed a little bit. every 100 years, but we can still see that language in common words that we share from Spain all the way to India. So the word meta in the original language became matra in Vedic in India, or other words, but the word we know as mother, you still see in every language that's spoken from India to Spain to Ireland. And as these people migrated east and west, their Y-DNA also changed a little bit every generation or two. And so this guy who we called Rib, who started this generation, this group of people, as they spread out east and west, their Y-DNA changed, so that eventually, after about 2,000 years have gone by, his descendants now are at the English Channel and with a genetic marker called L21. So those little tiny changes in DNA every 100 years or so. Now, L21 is a complicated word, so let's just call him Liam. Liam was probably born around 2500 BC, probably France, possibly England. Liam was the high-tech guy of his day. He had a horse and a chariot. He had a bronze sword and a knife. He had advanced agricultural skills. 70% of Irish men alive today are descended from Liam. So he's your great-great-great-great-grandfather to the 100th degree. And while Liam's ancestors were migrating their way across Europe while this whole thing was going on, Neolithic, who we call the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, lived in Ireland, and they were putting rocks on top of rocks. And the wonderful building and architecture that they did from the dolmens of Ireland and Newgrange, if you haven't been to Newgrange yet, still stand today as monuments to these people's building ability. But around the year 2500, these people declined and disappeared, and Liam's descendants replaced them around the year 2000 BC. And the best theory right now is that maybe some kind of disease might have contributed to the decline of the Neolithic Irish people. But when these people disappeared, Liam's descendants took over, and they were powerful. They had chariots and bronze weapons and horses. So they had a whole new culture that they brought to Ireland. And these are these people that we call descended from Liam. We also know that Billy Idol was there. And we've also found out recently that they got their pajama bottoms at the Gap. The reality is they probably didn't dress like this, but we are learning more about these people all the time. Today, Irish men are probably less diverse than the chart that we showed about Irish women. About 80% of Irish men are descended from Rib, R1b. And most of those people, 70%, are descended from Liam, L21. So very, very important factor in terms of the population of Ireland around the year 2000. Now, for the next 2,000 years after Liam, what happened? Liam's descendants weren't couch potatoes and they weren't flower children. They were happy to spend their free time raiding their neighbors for cattle and land and slaves. And they even wrote great stories and legends about it, like the Toynbee Caillinge and other stories about their warfare and the stealing of cattle. Ireland probably had about 120 chiefdoms, each of which probably had about 70 odd warriors. And one of these groups of people, called the Dalriada, were known to the ancient Romans as Scotti. They called them the Scotti. And they said the Scotti were these Irish raiders who invaded and raided the western coast of Scotland, conquering the western coast of Scotland from the ancient Picts who lived there and creating the first Scotland. So the first Scots were actually Irishmen called the Dalriada. And the Irish during this time were skilled metal workers. They worked gold, and their gold for this period has been found as far away as Germany. Now, let's lead on and talk about the descendants of Liam who became Traynors. Now, around the year 2200 BC, Liam's descendants are in Ireland. How do we know that? Well, we know it because they have excavated two L21 Liam descendant skeletons, Rathlin Island off the northern coast of Ireland. So we know that they had reached that far by 2200 BC. And over the course of the next few centuries, things start to happen. A particular genetic marker in the children of Liam starts to become dominant in Ulster. And by the year 200 BC, these people who will ultimately call the O'Neills start to appear in Ulster. At the same time, actually around 375 AD, a guy named Many More with a particular genetic marker, I won't make up a name for that, I'll just call him Many More, left Monaghan, left Oriel, as it was called then, and defeats a guy named Kieran de Furbolg in Roscommon. So he moves out of Monaghan and he goes southwest and captures new territory for his family. Over the course of the next 800 years, the descendants of Many More who became Traynors see lots of little genetic mutations, and we can track those. But the funny thing is we don't see, oh, pardon me, one more thing to add. When we look at the descendant of Many More who became the first Traynor, we're going to call him Sean. It's actually more like a two-syllable name, like Sean. And that's basically the same name that the Germans would use as Johann. It just changed a little bit over time. And we think Sean lived about 1300 AD. And very, very rapidly after Sean, the family breaks into six different branches. And those branches are, we've called them, we just made up the name, the Aid, the Brendan, the Cormac, the Dermot, the Iana, and the Finn. And those six branches occur really quickly after Sean. So probably 1300 to 1400 AD. And this is something called the founder effect, where one guy gets rich and he suddenly has a big family and does very well for himself. At the same time that this is all going on, the O'Neills descend, and we see the first O'Neill Traynor around the year 1300, who we're just going to call Neil instead of that long alphabet soup. And over the same period, other descendants of Many More become the Kellys of Roscommon. And that includes people like William Boyle Kelly, if you're into Irish history. So we see this branching happen a couple times. But one thing that is interesting is we don't see this part of the Traynor ancestry tree branching, and we kind of don't know why. We have ideas. For example, maybe this guy only had daughters, and so his Y DNA didn't get passed on. So the tree did branch, but we didn't see any other people getting his Y DNA. And maybe this guy died before he could have kids. And maybe this guy just wanted to play golf and didn't want to pass on his DNA. For whatever reason, we don't see the tree branching at all between the year 375 AD and 1300. But suddenly after 1300, you see the Hymany tree start to branch. And by the way, the same thing happens with the O'Neill Traynor tree, which I'll show you in just a moment. The key thing to look at here is to remember that bottlenecks like this happen in history. So one guy, one survivor of this family tree survived to create the entire Hymany Traynor branch that we call the Monaghan Traynors. And a different guy survived to create the O'Neill Traynor tree. Now let's talk about the O'Neill Traynors for a minute. We see the same pattern in the O'Neill Traynors. So a long period, 1,000 years or something or more, where we see no mutations, no other children. So just one branch that survived to the present. And we don't know why. Again, we have ideas about it, and I'll talk about that more later on. But the key point here is around the year 1300, we have the first O'Neill Traynor, who we're going to call Neil. Just keep it simple. And Neil's family also spreads out. And we see different branches of the O'Neill Traynors suddenly emerging. So we have Sean Traynor and Geoffrey Traynor, Ronald Traynor, Michael Lane, Leslie Holden Traynor, Patrick Joseph Traynor, Mark Traynor, and Brian Traynor from Newry. And what we see in common of these people is that they seem to have all come from the area at the far east of Monaghan called Carlingford Loch. And that's the one thing we seem to have found in common among the O'Neill Traynors, that they all seem to come from this one area. Some of you may actually have been to Carlingford Loch. And we're going to learn more about this, but so far we haven't found a lot more than this, and I'm going to solicit as much help as I can in trying to learn more about the O'Neill Traynors. Now let's spend a minute on the Hymany Traynors. Hymany Traynors descended from this guy, we think many more, and then after about 800 years, suddenly we see the explosion of the Hymany Traynors into 6 different branches, and we've named the branches alphabetically. We don't know their real names necessarily, but we do see 6 branches suddenly and spontaneously emerging. And maybe they were 6 brothers or 6 cousins, we don't know that for sure. But the first branch we call A, just because we numbered them alphabetically. And again, you see this alphabet soup, which you don't have to remember, but we use that alphabet soup to figure out who is related to who and who descended from who. So for example, Seamus Miles Traynor and I share the same genetic markers, which means that we're cousins. It actually turns out probably to be my 5th cousins, but we're cousins. And Peter and Yankee John are also from the A tree, and other Traynors, including the Figaharley and the Beckin and the Briney, all come out of this branch, and some are more closely related to others, as you can see in this tree diagram, and some are more distantly related. We also have the Brendan Traynors, who we know came from a variety of places, Tyrone and Antrim and Carrick Macross. And that includes Marty McGinn and Michael Traynor and Robert Burns, Patrick Traynor Jr., Jeff Traynor, Ann Purdy, Raymond Traynor, John Fitzgerald Traynor, and Michael S. Traynor. So that branch is separate and distinct from the A's. And the same thing's true of the Cormac Traynors from Wicklow, including Dr. Sean Traynor and Luke. We have the Dermot Traynors, including our 2 Knowles, Noel Miller and Noel Thrush, as well as Scott Traynor and Doug Traynor. We have the Iana Traynors emerging at the same time after 1300, including Ted and his cousins, Bill and Brownie, David Joseph Traynor, Jeannie Morris, Bill Ormsby Traynor, Jeff Traynor, Tom McPhillips, Michael Paul Traynor, and Mel Traynor. And then we have the Finn Traynors, and the only one we found so far is Charles Traynor. Charles, we are still working on finding a cousin for you, and I promise you we'll find one. I'm way over in that first column. I'm John DNA Traynor, but we can tell you where you are in this tree, just like we've done it for everybody else. So where are you? We can help to find out where in the tree your family came from. Now, the contribution of Irishmen has been immense, not just because they've given us genetic tests, but also because they've supplied history that we would never have had and told us where their families lived and where they came from, which has been incredibly valuable. And when we look into this history, we find, for example, that the O'Neill Traynors seem to have originated around Carlingford Loch, and we mentioned that already. So that was a wonderful piece of information. When we go to the Hymany Traynors, we see a little bit of a different picture. They appeared to have originated in Monaghan, where you probably are sitting right now, and they spread out to other counties. But from the overlapping nature of those branches, the Aid in Arundel True and maybe Donagh, the Brendans, the Cormacs, the Dermods, the Iana, and the Finn, when we look at this, based on what Irishmen have told us about where their family came from, we see that 4 out of the 6 branches actually overlap in a reasonably small area, which I'll call maybe Donagh or Emyvale, which I believe to be the first homeland of the Traynors, of this guy who we'll call Sean, because 4 out of the 6 branches overlap in that one little spot right there. So if there's a homeland to the Traynors, that's where we think it is. Now, I'm going to take a break here for a minute and go in a different direction. If you want to explore more about your townlands, you can do it. Michael has set up this wonderful website called Traynor.org. And on that website, you have the ability to go to the website and to drill down and actually drive down the streets or the roads where your family came from. Now, I'm going to give you a demo of this because I think it's a lot of fun. And not a lot of people have actually seen this yet. Now, hopefully this will work. I'm going to click over and go to a different site. This is the Traynor.org website. And here I'm going to go to roots, and you see the word Traynor DNA. And I'm going to click on the genetic branches of the Traynors. And here you see that chart that I just showed you showing where all the Traynors come from. But if you go down to the bottom, you see that we've got the branches. And I'm particularly interested in the aid Traynors because I'm a Miles. So I'm going to click on the aid Traynors and drill down into more information about them. And I see right away that this is where the aid Traynors seem to be concentrated. Well, I'm a Miles, so I want to know more about the Miles. I'm going to click on that, and it's going to tell me, oh, well, these are where the Miles Traynors were recorded as living, and maybe briefly and maybe for a long time. But to the best of our ability to know, the Miles seem to have originated at Dava Otra. And so I'm going to click on Dava Otra and go in and explore a little bit. So now, because I'm on Google Streets, I can actually go around and drive down the streets around Dava Otra and explore the area. And you can do this for every place that we've identified a Traynor homeland. So I invite you all to get in and explore that because I think it's wonderful to be able to drive down the streets and the towns of Ireland and see where your grandfathers walked. Now I'm going to tab back here and continue with our presentation. Some people have asked, when did the Hymany Traynors and the Kellys part ways? Do we know that? Well, we can guess. There are two theories. One is that the ancestors of the Traynor stayed in Monaghan when their cousin many more wandered off. And the other one is that a descendant of many more who went to Connaught came back at some point to Monaghan. So either they stayed or they went and came back because we know the Traynors came from Monaghan. Can we use anything to figure that out? Can we use mutations to try to answer that question? Well, yeah, we can try because we know that there's like one of these little mutations every 80 to 100 years, but frankly, the answer is still unclear. Our best guess is that the common ancestor of the Kelly and the Traynor lived around 466 to 700 AD. So by that, it probably happened after many more wandered off, and maybe a Traynor came back. So maybe the split happened in Connaught. Now, we can't be positive, but that's a theory. Why do both the Hymany and the O'Neill families show long periods before 1300 with no branching? Well, plague and warfare probably don't account for all of it. Why do surnames or Traynor nicknames or Y-DNA patrilineal lines or mitochondrial lines disappear? Well, let's do a real quick case study. This is my great-great-grandfather, Bernard Traynor of Mullahinshigo, born in 1819. And I'm going to show you his sons and his daughters, and I'm going to track the Y-DNA of his descendants. Now, because women can't have Y-DNA, they can't pass it on, only men are going to pass on Y-DNA. So I'm going to show the Y-DNA history. We see that Bernard Traynor had lots of kids. And the Y-DNA gets passed on by Bernard to his sons. And some of his sons have sons and some don't. But we see that each of his sons has at least one son. And so that Y-DNA is getting passed on. And again, some sons don't have kids. And I'm not tracking the descents of the women here because we're tracking Y-DNA here. Just you get the same effect if you use mitochondrial DNA. You will see the descendancy of women, and the pinks would all be showing, and we'd be ignoring the blues. But the the key here is that the sons have sons and then sons have daughters, until all of a sudden we get to the bottom and all we've got is pinks except for one boy. Now, why does this happen? Well, on this chart, we've got 28 men. And of those 28 men, 17 have kids. And of the men having girls, daughters, there are 15. And they have about 1.86 girls each, which gets you to 28 girls on this chart. And men having sons, there are 12, and they have a 2.3 per, which also gets us to 28. So we have 28 boys and 28 girls on this chart. So why are we running out of Y DNA? Well, we have 11 men who didn't have kids. And that becomes critical. By the way, that is my great nephew, John Traynor. So hopefully he'll pass it on, but he may not. My Traynor family males are equally likely to have sons and daughters. However, 1/3 of my family's males don't have kids at all. At this probability, male DNA, and if you look at it the other way, mitochondrial DNA from women can die out and disappear. The great news is we still have our granddaughters, like my granddaughter Lucy in Atlanta, to carry on all the wonderful things that we've learned and taught to our children. Now, it's not about having sons. It's not even about having children. No one should commit themselves to raising children unless they want them, or unless they don't have a mule to pull the plow, in which case maybe a kid's a good idea. However, the probability of a particular Y DNA line surviving to be preserved and recorded balances on the edge of a razor. Male Y DNA and female mitochondrial DNA lines disappear. If we're interested in preserving family history, we are swimming against a current which you have seen traces back hundreds of years with those bottlenecks of 1,000 years with barely one person surviving. Now, what can we know about the Treinfhirs between 1300 AD, Ceallaigh Traynor, and 1700 AD? Well, we can find documents that tell us things. This is called the genealogy of the clan Traynor O'Connor. And it's at Trinity College Dublin, and you can actually find it. And this is what it looks like. It's just a couple pages out of the entire folio. But one thing jumps out, and that's the O'Connor mention. That part is clearly untrue. The Treinfhirs are not descended from the O'Connors. So we know that some of this information is just creative fiction, but maybe some of it might be valid, might be good. For example, what part of the 1650 genealogy is believable? We think the most recent part. This is in reality the genealogy of a guy named Adam Traynor, who probably lived in the late 1600s. And Adam certainly knew the name of his father, who, by the way, was called Treinfhir, which is kind of a scary old Irish boogeyman name, which is kind of cool. But he probably knew the name of his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, because the Irish were very good at remembering that stuff. And so we see a lot of information here that's probably, at least in recent history, accurate. And fascinatingly, we find a reference to Sean, who was the first person of the Traynor name who came into Oriel, into Monaghan. When Neil, the proud son of Magnus, was king of Oriel, is when that Sean came from the plains of Connaught, which is interesting. And by the way, Neil is a historical figure. Neil McMahon, also called Neil the Arrogant and Neil the Bandit, died around 1238. So we actually have maybe some evidence here that a Traynor named Sean came into Monaghan around the year 1230, 1200 or 1230 or somewhere in that area. And even maybe some guidelines as to who the first guy named Traynor might have actually been. Now, this is not all guaranteed to be accurate because some people had creative stories, but I think it's useful to know there are sources out there that we can use. And maybe there is evidence here that the Treinfhirs actually came into Monaghan around the year 1200 from what some people call the plains of Connaught, which is actually Sligo. So came from the west into Monaghan. It seems to make some sense. We got 13 generations between Sean and Adam. And if every generation is 30 years, that's 390 years. The math makes sense. So maybe this is really true. For ambitious genealogists, identifying the people in this document could be invaluable to our family history. Let's look at the Annals of Ulster, which is a primary source of history for Northern Ireland. In the year 1505, William McTraynor Jr. dies this year of the disease of his leg. Well, who was this guy William the Younger that his disease of his leg was so important? People die every year and nobody writes it down. Who is this William and why is he important? Is William the Younger the guy that we saw a couple pages back, William, son of Ceallaigh Yosa the Red Hair? Could that be him? In addition, who was the founder of the O'Neill Traynors? Can we find Neil, or whatever his real name was, can we find him in history and go back? These are all wonderful opportunities for each of you to pursue. The truth is out there for you to find. There are Irish records, legends, annals that all of you can find on the web and do research on. Now, what's next? What's next for the Treinfhir DNA Initiative? We've come so far, but we have a long way to go. First, and probably most importantly, we need to preserve the lineage and the family history of living Traynor Irishmen. As I showed you before, we only know, because of living Irishmen, the stories of where Traynors lived and what their homelands and townlands were. And we are incredibly grateful for those men, particularly men who contributed both their family stories and their DNA so we could put the two together. Help us to link your townlands, your nicknames, your family to preserve the history. Y-DNA subsidies, for those of you who are interested in taking a Y-DNA test, Y-DNA subsidies are available. We can lower the cost for Irishmen who can contribute their family history and help us to map the history of this important clan. We've gotten a lot of tests through, ranging from Becken and Briney, the Carrick Traynors, the Traynors from Drogheda, the Finn, the Millers Morris, Miles Traynor, but there are a lot of nicknames and family locations that we have not been able to test DNA for. So if you know somebody who's in one of these nicknames or groups or families, please, or if you know somebody who's got a different nickname, please let us know, and we'd like to get them tested and find a way to preserve their family history. Now, what we see is with the Aids and the Brendans and the Cormac's and the Dermids and the Iana and the Finn, we've collected a lot of information, but there's still an enormous amount of information that we'd like to be able to collect. Just like my cousin Seamus and I have recorded our family history and our DNA. Second, what's next? Linking immigrants, people who left Ireland, to branches of the family tree. For those of you whose families left Ireland to America or England or Australia or Spain, your Y-DNA, your exact Y-DNA, may no longer even be present in Ireland. My great-great-grandfather, Bernard, only has one linear great-great-great-great-grandson with his Y-DNA. Seamus, Miles, and I have preserved our DNA and our family histories so it won't be lost, although my Y-DNA could be gone in a generation or two. Too many families' connections to the Traynor tree are being lost to time. And obviously, it's not just about donating your family history and DNA. The donors, cash donors to the project, are the people who've made this whole thing work. So for all of you who've made a contribution, thank you. Finally, what's next? For both Irishmen and immigrants, please capture your link to history before these connections disappear. Already today, we have female descendants of Traynors searching for their Traynor ancestry. Consider your granddaughters. Don't wait for your family's Y-DNA to disappear. as the Miles Y DNA is fading. I've preserved my family line, my genealogy, and my DNA, and my Irish cousin Seamus has preserved his, along with a wonderful document of genealogy that his family had. Please join your family into the Traynor Tree Project. Find your home in the Traynor clan. Hopefully you'll find something on your chair today that invites you to join the Treinfhir DNA Initiative. That little square, if you use your camera on your phone, will allow you to go to the Family Tree DNA webpage for the Traynor project. I'd like to call out a couple of people who've been fantastic in contributing. Leigh Crumby, Leigh has taken the autosomal project where we find cousins of cousins and just done a wonderful job on it. So I'd like to give a shout out to Leigh. Brilliant job, great leadership. Leigh is running the Autosomal DNA Initiative, helping cousins find cousins. Kathy Weber wants to lead the maternal line ancestry project. So if you want to learn more about the mothers of Treinfhirs and the mother's line, she is leading the Mitochondrial DNA Initiative. Her email address is here. Of course, you all know our Irish leadership, Noel Thrush and Noel Miller. These are the guys who are really connecting information about families and their histories and where they lived and Irish records back into the project. And we could not be more indebted to them, to Noel and everyone else in Ireland who has contributed. And then, of course, I'm always available for Y-DNA questions and assistance. With that, I'm going to say thank you. If you're watching this recording canned, please feel free to send me an email with any questions you have. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you.